Dax, a natural question that we all get asked one way or another, however it's phrased, is how come you became an artist? Maybe I can direct that question to you.
That's assuming I see myself as an artist. I I don't approach my... Yeah, it's a tough question. Because when someone uses the term artist, there's all that cultural baggage that's attached to it, and do you see yourself in that lineage, in that baggage, or do you want, try to be progressive, if that's a possibility, and be outside that? I think people use the notion artist to allow you to do things that are outside of typical society's norms. Like if you're on the street doing something that's unusual, then you tell someone, "Oh, I'm an artist," or "I'm doing an artwork," or this. Then you're kind of given more space to do those sorts of things. But yeah, usually I don't think of myself as an artist per se. It's more, it's like, what am I doing at that moment, and that's the hat I'm donning. So if it's installing other people's work, then I'm an installer. If I'm fabricating work for someone or something, then I'm a fabricator. So yeah, and artist, it's something I tend not to do.
Interesting. Perhaps that leads then to another question, and that is, what does an artist do? Because if we have a fabricator on one side, or a swimmer on the other side, or a bicyclist on the other side, we know kind of what they do.
Yeah.
What does an artist do?
I think that's up to whoever wants to call themselves an artist. Like it's. I think we're at a point now where it's so wide open that it's kind of just. It's a title, but I don't think it necessarily has any kind of constriction to it. Like it seems like you have rock stars or pop stars who are calling themselves artists, or it's also kind of like that notion of curator, like people who are putting things together, but they're curating. It doesn't seem to have the same kind of presence that it once did, or the power. Like it doesn't have that all being, all knowing kind of history that it used to have. Like it, yeah. It's weird because I think of someone like Joseph Beuys, where or maybe that's the thing is I guess if I'm going to think of an artist, I'm going to think of someone who could do nothing but art. So for Canadian reference, I would use someone like John Scott. I could not see John Scott doing anything other than creating artwork. So I don't know if that's just because his life has led to that position where, that's the only way I can view him as a person, or if it's just that's what he is. There's something intrinsic about that person's nature. So I guess I don't see that within myself, so it seems hard. That's why I don't use the notion, or I don't use that term artist, because I know I can do other things. If worst case scenario, I couldn't do what I'm doing now for income, well, I can go work in a factory, or I can go hang drywall, or there are other skills I have. So yeah, I guess I don't see that as just the only part of my being. And so yeah, I guess I think maybe that's the other thing, is maybe the notion of calling yourself an artist is too limiting. Why just be that? Why can't you just be more? And so yeah.
So often when one calls oneself an artist, sooner or later one signs that there is a signature. And in many cases, people look for that signature in order to decide whether that person is an artist, a genuine artist perhaps, or not. So you feel that the question of the signature is open.
I think so. But then, maybe I'm being too literal with your question, but when I think of signature, signing your name to something, I have always avoided that. At a certain point, I was like, I'm not going to sign my work anymore, and so I had a rubber stamp made. But I think that might have also been influence of either someone like Greg Renault or Stephen Andrews, who has a chop. So, but then I think, you know, I think it's also with the signature, it changes over the years. You develop a signature, so it at the same time using a stamp, it was like this will be, like it'll be the same, you know, from the beginning till the end. Like the only thing that's going to change is the amount of ink on the stamp, but otherwise it's kind of there's a continuity.
I'd like to just quote something here, and I don't hold you to it, but it's a small comment on your work, and it has to do with suggesting that when it comes to the question of what is core to your work, if we can call that signature, that it constitutes a trace of the topology of the site as a unique space filled with potentially infinite spatial narratives. I'm not sure what you would make of that.
I know that's definitely not my quote. That might be someone, yeah. But then I think that's also something I've done consciously, is not talk about my work or not write about my work, just because I see that as someone else's role, or also at the same time allowing, you know, other readings to happen. Yeah, I'm wondering where that quote's from, but so then I'm trying to think of what it's in relationship to. So can I ask, or?
Yes, of course.
Not that, but it would give me context to, or at least I think it would.
There's a show at Access Gallery.
Oh, so that would be James, who is like that, yeah, who's, yeah.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, it's just, I haven't really thought about, like, I know where James is coming from in regards to that work, because it's referencing a body of work that he came across in a studio visit where I had worked as a picture framer, and material that would come in to be framed would become, you know, something would come in framed, but then the new owner of the work would want to have it reframed, and then when you take apart the old frame, there would be either labels on the back or signatures or other material that some people valued and then some people didn't value, and those who didn't want the old gallery label or whatever it was, that would be material that would end up in the garbage, and then I would scavenge that material and then reframe it in the same way that the person was having their work framed, so kind of keeping it, you know, in some way tied to the piece still. But it was also my way of collecting things that I wouldn't normally be in the possession of. But yeah, I think it's that working behind the scenes and being in a position where you can access things that very few who are entering a gallery get to, you know, be around or be in. But yeah, I'd have to probably read that quote 4 or 5 more times and really think about it. But
well, maybe I can link it back to something you said earlier, and the question of if there is a way of understanding the role of an artist or the naming of an artist, or the occupation of that name, that it involves a question at the ground level of space, of having spatial mobility that perhaps other designations don't.
yeah.
And I wonder if part of your core interest, and I don't want to assign a leading question here, but part of your core interest would be operating out of this notion of the mobility of space, that an artist is perhaps in a unique position to possess.
Yeah, I think then it's also just being in unique positions. Like, I think depending on what your work is about or where you are, that's going to inform your work, and it allows you to, you know, I guess either expose things or, you know, not expose, shed light, or just offer up the chance for others who are maybe outside that space to see within it. But yeah, it's...
I was most intrigued coming back to this question of a particular work that might embody or suggest what would constitute the signature that you like to work with as an artist. I come back to a piece of yours I saw at Diaz Contemporary, where you had taken the paint chips from a number of different public gallery spaces, public and private, and painted a series of paintings based upon those paint chips, as I understood it. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that one was then essentially confronted with not just the gallery one was in, but the echo, the ghost of other galleries in which art functions. And in some respects, it occurred to me at the time, rightly or wrongly, that one could see this as a kind of institutional critique. Would you accept that term, or?
Yeah, I'll just let you know. With that project, I actually mailed every institution a small container of paint, and then they would fill it up with the actual paint that they were using, their gallery white that they were using. Send it back to me. I would include postage, just trying to make the project as easy as possible, so you have the most participating galleries. And then, yeah, with that paint used to paint a piece of drywall that was laminated to a piece of plywood, mimicking a gallery wall. I can see how people would read it as an institutional critique. For me, it was more like it was there were a bunch of things happening. One was coming out of a grad school program and realizing that to get shows you should be known. And so one way to be known is to have an actual dialogue with curators and directors, and how better than to be asking them for something of their institution, showing interest in their institution, but then also trying to do a project where you just wanted to amass something that you wouldn't normally ask for, or people wouldn't think about. Like, that's the other thing, is when you go into a gallery and you see a white wall, you don't think about the shade of white or the different. And so that was the fun thing with that project, was then you could see the varying shades of white. And some, when you saw them, they didn't look white at all. Like, it seemed they took on more of a creamy aspect. But it was also, yeah, for some reason the idea just popped into my head that I should, do this project. And then it's, how do you contact, or who do you contact at the institution? And so then it's also working within the institution. If you ask one person and you don't get a reply, then you either move up the ladder or down the ladder, and or then with a lot of Canadian galleries, they're a pretty small organization, so then you're dealing with just the director, who's also the curator, who so yeah, so there was trying to get noticed in a way, but also wanting to see if the galleries were as white as you think they are. But yeah.
So it was an institutional critique directed not just at institutions, as we understand them, but also at the institution of the artist who seeks to be
noticed, or to yeah. And I think it was also it's one of those things where it's great to have ideas, but then it's the follow through, and also wanting to create things that look like paintings but aren't paintings. So it's interesting when people talk about them as paintings, because to me I see them in a three-dimensional form. Because it's drywall, it's not typical in terms of an artist's surface to paint on. But then also because of the plywood underneath, referencing the construction of the gallery wall. So yeah, then it becomes like one of those things where it's like, is it an educational tool too, where people then, coming in realize, oh, there's plywood behind the wall, then why is there plywood behind the wall? And so it kind of goes in weird directions. But then, yeah, as the years progressed, I realized, I made a lot of assumptions with that. So then assuming that everyone has half-inch plywood, but some might have 5, or not plywood, but half-inch drywall on. So in reality, if I was to probably do that project again, I might be a little bit more specific in terms of, how are your walls constructed exactly, and just trying to properly mimic their walls so they have a true representation, as opposed to everyone kind of being the same, even though they're not.
One gets the notion, however. There was another work of yours, I don't know if you want to expand on it at all, but it was quite different, but perhaps in the same arena, which was a piece I think you showed at the Barnack at one point. It was a graph of various artists, how they intersected.
It was a project that I haven't abandoned, I just haven't kept up. But yeah, at a certain point, which it came out of the white painted drywall section. But looking at, it's actually kind of funny because James, who you quoted earlier, he's probably more the reason I did the project. But I was watching how people move through the institutions, or move from institution to institution, so migration patterns. And with directors and curators, then you start to wonder if there are certain patterns that develop, like, is this institution a stepping stone to this institution, and then once you hit this institution, where, and then also the movement of people across the country. So for that exhibition, it was, I think, just the 80s that were covered, just to keep it kind of clean and concise. But ideally, when it gets done, it actually becomes one of those things where you can interact with it and you can see, like, you could enter in someone's name, and then you could see which institution they started at, where they went, or you could put in the year and you could see the movement in that year, or you could just go by institution. So you could put in the Burnaby Art Gallery, and then you could see, if anyone left or where, and then where they were coming from. So it started out that I thought it'd just be a simple drawing on a large sheet of paper, and then connecting the dots. But then as it progressed and as you gain material in terms of like people's dates and positions, because it separates them between being a director and being a curator, but then it becomes problematic when you have assistant curators and or associate curators. So then you have to start kind of calling the groups and deciding who gets to be represented and who doesn't or then that's also problematic, because then it's like, is someone who's an assistant curator at the National Gallery, would they be the equivalent of I know this is going to get in trouble, but would they be the equivalent of a curator at a smaller, regional gallery? So like, there's a lot of egos involved too in how they see themselves. But going back to James, was he, like a few of his colleagues, had moved fairly frequently, not for whatever the reason, from institution to institution. So it's just one of those things where, like, in the time I've known him, I think he's traveled between 4 institutions. So, and that's not like, it's going on 10 years now, but it's still, that's a lot of movement. Or anyone who's moved 10 years from job to job, that's a lot of, moving. So then it became a question, if James did it, I wonder what other people have done. And then, But
one thing that connects these two bodies of work, and what are the titles of each of them, if I may?
The first project, the painted plywood, or the painted drywall and plywood, that's, the whole project is referred to as details, because it's the idea of it's a detail of the wall. And then the other project is called Migration Patterns, because it's pretty well following the patterns of, in this case, rather than animals, people, or very specific people.
What connects them, as I was saying, seems to be an incredible interest in materiality and a very careful sense of execution, and of course constantly presentation. So there's a kind of exquisite quality to these works, if I may put it that way. Would you see it that way? Would you see that as an important aspect of your practice?
I would say that's probably a very important aspect of my practice. It's just when I go to see other people's work, if if there's something wrong with the presentation, then I wouldn't say I dismiss the work, but I have a hard time further engaging with the work. And so it starts with the presentation, and then it goes to materials and how the materials are handled. And then if the material handling is clumsy, not on purpose, but because of, for whatever reason, then that also becomes a barrier for me. So it's one of those things where I find it very hard to go into an exhibition and not find, not flaws, but little problems that, like, and then it might just also come down to, you know, did they sweep the cobwebs out of the corner? Like, so then it becomes one of those things where, like, that's outside the artist's, you know, kind of role and what their control, but at the same time, those who are presenting the work, you know, did you sweep up? Do you, or if the light is burnt out, have you replaced the light? So it's not necessarily about the work, it's about everything. And yeah. And I know when I enter galleries now, I have a I don't want to say reputation, but I'm known for, I guess, having that critical eye, and it's happened a few times where commercial dealers have come up and said, you know, I know this is wrong, or or there's this problem with this, or like, and so it's just one of those things where it's like, it's weird to be, you know, kind of either feared or regarded in terms of your opinion or the way that, you know, you're gonna read the exhibition. But at the same time, you know, it's just who I am. I can't turn it off. I can't change it. But I also, I do enjoy the fact that I know that other people, when they're installing their exhibitions, and, you know, they've told me, you know, I was thinking about you when we were, because they know I'll come in and, like, be critical, but being fair in your critique. Like, you can't hide those sorts of things. Like,
I look forward to reading your texts if and when you decide to be an art critic as well as an artist.
yeah, well, like, who was it? Donald Judd, NASCAD put out his critical writings, and the part of, like, I typically don't read essays or critiques just because it doesn't interest me in that regard. But what I enjoy about that publication is towards the back of it, he talks about art handlers and installers and the way they handled his work, and to me that offers more insight. And so it, you know, like, if someone was shipping something, they would put a label onto one of his works, but, you know, because the surface needs to be pristine, then you've just basically ruined. So he talks about, you know, how his work has been ruined by, you know, just people handling things but not understanding how to handle it. Or so that, yeah, like that, when artists talk about those sorts, like, just the day-to-day, you know, kind of problems that you run into, that, yeah. Or then other people talking about art shippers who come to pick up work, and, you know, the person's partner has given them cotton gloves to handle the sculpture, to take it out, and they're like, oh yeah, and then they get the sculpture to the gallery, and then when the artist gets to the gallery and sees the sculpture, there's scratches or nicks, and it's just like, it's that sort of care. But I think that comes back to framing and, you know, handling other people's work that you want to kind of preserve for the next, because there's nothing worse than when you damage something, like having your stomach just kind of drop out of your body, and it's not a pleasant feeling. So
I think you're speaking to the relations between material and idea, and I think you've spoken to that articulate as much as I could ask. I won't ask that question. But I'm curious. I'm going to turn to the question of art history, and I wonder, to what extent does art history interest you, or the practices that other artists have produced?
It's pretty important. Like, it's also knowing where you lie in terms of history and knowing who has come before you, but also referencing that work too. Like I realize I'm not working in a bubble or a vacuum, that there aren't other references or other people who have done similar works. So yeah, like I remember I did a project in Vancouver where I was asking galleries for samples of their paint to paint a wall in an artist run center for an exhibition. And one of the dealers was very, what's the word I'm looking for? They were very, well, they were reluctant, but also questioning why I was doing that. But then it became apparent that they represented someone who had either done similar, there were similarities in our work, so it seemed like the dealer was being very protective of their artist. But it's one of those things where I responded because, of course, you contact everyone through email, or for that project, it was, I'm living in Toronto, but I'm doing a project in Vancouver, so communication was through email. And I said something in a follow-up in email about, I'm not the only artist, doing work of this nature, like, but that was the end of the conversation, like, so that was bizarre. But getting back to your question, which was...
We mentioned Donald Judd a moment ago, and I know that wasn't in the context necessarily of Donald Judd as an artist.
Art history.
But yeah, the question of...
Yeah, but also, I think just being curious about what has come before. So, I didn't grow up, I grew up outside of the Toronto art scene in the 70s. So I'm curious, for me, I'm really interested in the Canadian history of art, but specifically Toronto in the 70s and 80s, because that seemed to be the beginning of conceptual art in Canada, which I understand my practice is heavily influenced by and paying homage to, but also I think it was a small enough scene that you could focus. There's a significant focus on those people who were producing work at that time. So yeah, it's one of those things, because I wasn't there, and then specifically with Toronto, it's more of an oral history, so the only way you hear about, or the only way to gain knowledge about that history is through either asking questions or just standing close enough to someone at an opening or part and listening to the stories, secondhand. Or then you hear, so-and-so did this. So, even though they weren't there, then you're still gaining insight into that history without actually being present. But yeah, I think it's also, looking back at a certain time with rose-colored glasses, I think if I was there, it might be a totally different story. Because I don't have those personal attachments or those histories with those people. So when someone brings up someone like Carmen Leman, my ears perk up, and it's like, tell me more. I know parts of his history, but then it's I think like everyone, you only know a little segment. But it's kind of acquiring those stories, and then it's like anytime I can hear about things that went on with the gallery, or things that or just stories about him applying a label to the back of a velvet painting, and then that label puckering the painting. So it's just one of those things where it's kind of funny, but then it's also kind of I can kind of glimpse more into that personality through those stories, or those actions.
Storytelling.
Yeah.
We can maybe shift from storytelling to a widely understood or misunderstood term, discourse, and another one, zeitgeist. And I'm kind of curious. Okay, so there's the work in Toronto from the 1970s and 80s, and I like this idea of storytelling and essentially what one might call gossip. But somehow in the same universe, there's this term zeitgeist, and the notion that there is some kind of discourse that emerges from a particular period. I'm kind of curious if you see anything like that happening at the moment. I know that's rather, one is on top of it, of course, but I just wonder if you feel there's a kind of dominant discourse of zeitgeist at the moment.
I don't know. Well, it's weird because I'm working I work in institutions that currently as an installer where they're currently right now revisiting history of Toronto, and so that seems to be pretty prevalent. But then I wonder if that's just a little, like, because I'm only in that sphere right now, like there might be other things happening that I'm not aware of, or like if I'm wondering, are other cities also revisiting their histories? But then Canada 150 is happening, so then everyone wants to talk about the last 150 years, and so talking about recent past, or well, more recent past than 150 years ago. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really.
That's an interesting point, though. I wonder if it is, in fact, more broadly relevant than simply the particular conditions of Canada or Toronto. I wonder if there is internationally a tendency to look back.
I think it's also, well, looking back, then you can reaffirm that, what has happened, or you can kind of build things up, give them more status or more presence. But yeah, it's one of those things where it feels like, or I think it makes you realize how insular your life can actually, well, I guess you being me, that your life can be. Like, you wake up, you go to your job, but then, and you do what you're doing, but then there are all sorts of things happening, not only down the street from you that you're totally unaware of, but it could be happening in the country or the province or even, the continent. So, but then I guess only time would allow you to be able to look back to see those connections, if they're happening, if they're not happening, or those similarities.
Maybe that's why, if it is true, why a sense of the past as being a dominant theme internationally and certainly nationally might take hold, because the sheer volume of the present tends to make it impossible to cohere it, and it's easier to cohere something from before, maybe.
Maybe, most likely. Or then, because it's in the past, it's, I don't want to say static, but it's not changing in that way. Your views or people's opinions might evolve or change or about certain situations, but yeah, whereas right now, because everything is quick and fast and immediate, or theoretically, because I'm sure in 10 years we'll just be like, man, that was really slow back then. It's because it's frozen in time. You can sit there and you can dissect it and you can pull it apart and then put it back together. Whereas the present, it's too fluid, too quick to kind of hold down.
If you had a strategic goal yourself, Dax, I'm not suggesting you do, it's a term, but had you a strategic approach to your practice, would you be able to define that?
If I did, I think it's, if anything, it's appeasing myself. Like, I know there are other people who, you can make work for other people, or you can make work for your peers, or you can make work for your collector, or you can make work for your dealer, or but for me, it's like, if I'm not happy with it, then it becomes a question of, well, why are you doing it? And so, yeah, I think if anything, or then it might just be like, does it make me chuckle? Like, does it make me smirk? Like, sometimes it's just, if I can get just something out of it, then that's all it needs to be. Like I don't feel the need to kind of go out and be the next big thing. Like the grandeur of being the artist or being the celebrity, or like it's not what drives me, or it's not my focus. Like it's great when you get acknowledged or attention is, paid to you, but it's not why I'm doing what I do.
I'm getting a sense that there's a relationship here in your practice and in the way you speak to it, a relationship between nuance and comedy.
Yeah. No, I think it's also using humor as a tool to allow people into the work. Like if you if you have the tools that you can decode the humor, then great, and then that allows you to get into it. But I think it's also, I guess that idea that comedy is kind of universal. Like it strips everything down, and if it's funny, it's funny. If it's not, it's not. But it might also just because I'm listening to a lot of comedians as I'm making dinner, the wonders of the internet. But yeah, I think there's something really great about, being able to touch people, like rather than, being kind of heavy in another way, comedy's like a nice, gentle, I guess, way of reaching out to people, or allowing people access in. Maybe that's more than, yeah.
Listening to comedians, do you read literature, or does literature seem somehow important to your own the development of your own practice?
No. With the Donald Judd example, like, my reading is very limited. Usually it's reading, the caption beside the photograph, or the documentation to tell me what the material is if it's not evident. Like, yeah, I'm much more of a picture book person than a theory book. Like, it's just the way I approach work. For me, it's a visual thing, and so, like, yeah, I understand, that some people have the need for theory and want theory and expect theory, but then that's just not how I approach. That's not how I approach work when I'm looking at it, and then so then it seems kind of odd for me to go looking for it in a book format. Yeah.
I remember Liz Magor once telling me that she talks theory in the classroom, but when she goes to the studio, she shuts the door and shuts theory out.
Which is nice to do, if you can.
How do you move from one body of work to another? I'm thinking of the two works we just mentioned earlier, and we talked a little bit about what the connections between them might be, but I guess my question is directed at curiosity as to whether there's some external stimulus that produces a change in the work, or...
Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's just... sometimes it's just also the material, or in terms of history, like there's that idea of a bucket list, that before you pass away there are certain things you want to mark off on your bucket list. But I think more recently I've noticed that appearing in the way I approach making work. So there are certain things that I want to mark, certain mediums that I want to check off my bucket list. So if it's a letterpress project, then finding something that works in letterpress, so I can be like, yep, I did a letterpress piece, or a neon piece. And more recently I noticed that I haven't done a counting piece. Like, I've done counting pieces in the past, but there was another artist's work who, she had, simply just written the numbers 1 to 50, and I was like, I haven't done a number piece or a counting piece. And so then it's looking for a way to do that with a material. So then that leads you to other avenues. But usually it's an idea, like the idea will dictate medium. and then that will, you know, progress the project forward. But yeah, no, sometimes one project leads to another, but I think it's just also being open to, you know, whatever pops into your head, and, you know, do you want to follow that idea forward, or do you just, you know, think about it and then leave it as an idea? Like, that's also the beauty of where we are. Like, do you actually need to realize something physically for it to be completed? Like, it might be one of those things where you can picture it in your head, you can go, like, you've gone through all the different permutations it could possibly take, and you're done with the work. But then it doesn't exist outside your head, so then, you know.
Outside your head is the public. I'm kind of curious, particularly with this idea of a bucket list and the pursuing of projects that occur to you. The public often expects that signature we talked about earlier. Given the fact that you're not so interested in that, how do you expect the public to, how would you like the public to come to the work?
That's assuming it actually gets, because then you have to find a venue, or you have, like, that's where it becomes problematic. Like, you can create work, and then, you know, you end up storing that work in hopes that, unless you're active in terms of, you know, writing proposals or, you know, getting your work out there. But yeah, I guess traditionally it's, you know, in a white cube. But at the same time, I wouldn't be opposed to it being outside a white cube, but I think there's a certain neutral quality of the white cube that, you know, I guess because I like the clean aesthetic of a white cube, then I look for, you know, how does the work sit in a white cube, and how do I get the work into a white cube. But yeah, I think it's also one of those things where when I think of the work, I think of it in that situation. So there have been times where someone said, you know, well, what about doing this, you know, festival on the street? And it's just one of those things where it's like, I can't think of my work in that context, and so then it becomes, well, it just won't happen. But then at the same time, you know, having your work in a window display on the street isn't a white cube either, but there was a point where that had happened for me, so, but it still felt like a white cube. It just happened to have glass along one face of the space, so people could see in from the street. But yeah, no, I think if anything, I'm very steadfast with, you know, closed seal environment, tight constricted walls. Like, the smaller the space, the better. Just because unless you're really confident with, you know, using space, then that can become problematic as an artist. I don't know.
So a specifically motivated public.
Yeah. Or yeah, definitely. Like, I know the work that I have made in the past, and I'll probably make in the future, has a very specific audience, and I know some people may appreciate it for, you know, certain aspects, but I think being able to, you know, dive into the history that might be underlying that work, I know that my audience is a very narrow, specific group who will pick up on those references. But yeah, but that's also why I'm, you know, not at the big institute. Like, I haven't had the big shows, or I haven't, but then I don't think I'd want that. I don't see, I know my work doesn't fit into that, so I don't see, it doesn't make sense for me to, like, give it a second thought. It's out there. It's not, yeah. But I don't know, artists who can do it, it's interesting to watch how they handle, you know, presenting the work outside that, like, the context of the art world, like, you know, how you reach out to a broader audience, but then, I don't know, but then they also get chastised and criticized for that too, so it's like, some people, I'm sure they want both, but then you can never really have it.
Well, we're here in a studio, so it might be rather odd to ask, what do you think of the concept of a post-studio artist? going to assume that you see yourself as a studio artist. Would that be true?
Yes. No, I need to make things with my hands, or I understand things better if my hands have, being part of the process. That's not to say I'm against having other people fabricate work for me. For me, it makes more sense in terms of time and energy and also material to have someone, I'm not a neon fabricator, so it makes sense for me to seek out someone who is a neon fabricator if I want a neon piece done. But I think it's more the way you understand the world, and for me, I've always made things, and also the act of making things tends to allow you to make mistakes, and then those mistakes will either have a direct impact on the work in terms of the way you understand it, or it'll have there's always that notion of a happy accident. Like, I was doing this and then something happened that was unexpected, which can lead to something else. And the only way to do that for me is to be doing something physically. So, yeah, you won't necessarily understand, or you won't have those possibilities if you're always farming or sourcing someone else to make the work for you. However, I've also been in a position where I've had other people saying, can you make this for me? So then, at the same way, I also like the idea of a post-studio practice because, it has benefited me financially and allowed me to make my own work because of doing work for other artists. But yeah, I think it's more, if that's what you need to do, then great. But then at the same time, if I'm going to be in the gallery and I'm looking at your work and you've had it fabricated by someone else, it better be fabricated really well. Like that because I'm sure I'll notice, or other people, and then it's paying for what you get. So then when I see people who have their work, produced by someone else, and I see flaws, or there are things that I'm questioning, then I kind of feel even worse for that person, because at least if you're doing it yourself, you can kind of make that excuse, well, I'm not a woodworker, or I'm not a metal fabricator, or so that's why it looks the way it does. You can use that as an out, but when you're having someone else make the work for you, then yeah, there better be a level of confidence with what you're looking at.
What do you make of this notion? A friend of mine in Germany once made the statement, there should be less projects in the world and more work. There has been, of course, in the last several decades, a tendency for artists to involve themselves in projects, often forwarded to them by curators who invite them to do a project. What do you make of that?
It's funny that you bring that up, because I think of a conversation where I had with a dealer who I was installing in her gallery an artist's work, and she saw it more as projects in that regard were meant for bigger institutions where they could do more kind of, not outlandish, but larger scale, unusual things that might be outside their typical practice, whereas because she had a commercial gallery, then your commitment there is to sell work and have a commodity. So you kind of want to keep things a little bit more constricted in terms of what the artist is doing, because it's great and all to tear apart a gallery and have whatever happening within it, but if you're paying bills and paying rent, then you have to be realistic with what someone's going to ideally purchase for their own home or their own collection. But yeah, or just the idea of work, but there's something about being in the present as you're working, and as you're working, you're in that moment, as opposed to projects that seems a little bit more dreamy and idealistic than the actual physical part. But that's also maybe just who I am. There's something about the physicality of doing something that is rewarding, whereas a project is a little bit more kind of grandiose. I haven't ever been asked to do a project, so maybe I just don't realize how great it could possibly be.
Well, I guess I'm tempted to ask what you think of curators, but maybe instead I'll ask you what you think of critics, and if there's a particular kind of mode of criticism that you think is most useful from your perspective.
It's, yeah, critics. It's interesting because it feels like there aren't any critics. Like, or it's not this. It's not the historical critic. Very much like it's not the historical artist. Like there's not a critic, or I think there are very few critics right now who are known as being critics. But to keep it more localized, there just doesn't seem to be, like there's art criticism, but it just doesn't feel like it has the same kind of presence or strength that it used to have. I kind of wonder, but then at the same time, I don't typically read criticism. Like, I'll read criticism in terms of, ooh, what did they say? Like, in terms of, who was criticized and what were they criticized for, assuming it's criticism, because it tends to be now a lot more positive critiques as opposed to negative critiques. But when it's a negative critique, everyone's talking about it. But I think it's also like maybe there are less sites for it. So because there's like newspapers are cutting down on inches for articles, and so then if you're the critic for a newspaper, you're gonna probably write a positive review, or if you're gonna talk about work, it tends to be positive. Like, why would you wanna be harsh or critical or negative? Like it. So you tend, yeah, it's critics. I think it's also one of those things where my experiences with critics in the past, when they've talked about my work, it became very apparent that they had picked up the brochure at the gallery and were talking, well, kind of reiterating what had been written in the brochure, or so, yeah, but then it's also one of those things where maybe it's also someone just in a job and they're just going through the motions. Like they'll sometimes, have energy and, interest in being more in depth with something, but a lot of it just, I don't want to say fluffy. Fluffy's not, but it feels very surface coated. But then I know from what I've said already that I can also be very kind of just about the surface, and and so that's one of the problems when I'm looking at work, is if I hit those things, like if I see problems and I don't dive deeper, then I feel like I'm not giving the work its fair due. But because I've run into these obstacles, I feel like I don't need to give it any more thought or attempt. So I can see how they could easily say, well, you do the same thing. So it's a catch-22.
I suppose, although you don't describe yourself as an art critic.
No, I do not. Well, or people call me critical. So, but and I tend to be critical of the artwork because that's what I'm interested in. But at the same time, I'm also critical of pretty well everything that I come up with. Well, it's when you go into like the new Union Station remodel. There are just certain elements where they have stainless steel coming to a point, and then it dawned on them, oh, this isn't safe in case someone falls or trips, and so they've taken silicone and dolloped a big glob on that corner, and so then it's like, this is your solution to a problem that you should have already thought. So like, yeah, or then going into a space where they've done new drywall and they haven't sanded things properly, or there are pinholes. Just me being like picky and like, yeah.
Precise.
Exactly.
On the question of persistence, perhaps, that's pressures of maintaining a career can be immense, both in terms of the professional face of that career, but also in terms of the personal or home face of that career. how have you persisted?
That's a good question. Assuming I am persisting, because I mentioned to you earlier that yeah, I'm at a spot now where I haven't had the same level of output that I've had in terms of a practice and what I'm making in the studio as I have in the past. And so then it becomes one of those things, is it because I'm getting older and wiser and realize I don't have to do everything that pops into my head? Or is it because I have other interests that are outside of art? So rather than coming into the studio late at night to do something, that would be that would be studio focused. I rather, work on, getting some sleep so I can go for an early bike ride. So it's a weird kind of push and pull. It's also one of those things where I think it's also, there are projects that you envision and it's like, well, no one else is going to do this project, so I'm going to do it, but I don't want to say leisurely pace, but it's more at a pace that I don't feel like there's, maybe it is because I'm not older yet, but there's not that urgency yet, but I'm sure something will swing around and I'll feel that urgency to produce at a different level that I'm producing now. But it's just also balancing other things in your life, like how do you make a living? And my studio practice has never been my source of income, so it's never had that I've never felt the pressure that, this has got to keep money flowing in, so then, yeah.
I'd like to end with maybe a question that has two parts to it, but you can treat it as one if you wish. And that is, on the one hand, I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts on the art system as it currently operates. So that's one part of the question. And I'm kind of interested in relating that to another question, which is the question of authenticity and what would constitute a sense of the authentic in art or the authentic in practice. Perhaps given the particular logistics of the art system, by which I mean also the composition of the theoretical structures that inform it. So, originality and authenticity, do they operate today? Do you see that, from your own perspective, how would you see that operating against the background of the art system?
Wow.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is. I think it's rare that you see something truly authentic. I think it's more just because there's such a large history of the world. Like, you're going to be influenced by everything that's out there, and so that, yeah. But then, I don't know, it's interesting because the art system is very interested in not necessarily always having something authentic. If you have a practice, I think I'm going to go back to the idea of having a studio practice where that's your main source of income. And I know from working as a picture framer and framing things that are being sold or things that were going to be sold, you see the drive to not really have something new and different all the time from an artist, that you want them to develop either a style or kind of repeat, what's the word? Not repeat themselves, but repeat something that the public can say, that's artist X or that's artist Y. There's that, it's dangerous in that sense. Like, and so then you're just kind of like with the critic, you're going through the motions. You're just doing things to make a paycheck, but you're not necessarily doing things for yourself. Or maybe that's what you're doing it for, is, I get the paycheck and then I can go for my vacation wherever, I go for vacation. Or I can buy the car that I want, or I can buy the cottage, or whatever drives you. But yeah, I think if something was truly authentic, it'd probably be too unnerving.
You see that as an aspect of your own work then?
It doesn't unnerve me, so no. But I see, like, when I look at my work, I see the lineage of those who came before me. I see references to other people, and if I see it, I know other people are going to see it. I know that yeah, or at least maybe I hope that other people will see it. But yeah, I want to believe I'm a unique little snowflake, but I'm not. And I know that the work I'm doing isn't something from left, like it's not coming out of the blue. It's there. I'm either someone who's, you know, maybe shedding a light on it first, or, you know, pulling it closer to the light so other people can see it. Like I know that other people have pulled at it. I'm the most recent, and then there are going to be more people behind me who are going to do the exact same thing.
That being said, it does strike me from the conversation we've had that that sense of critical precision might constitute some form of authenticity.
Yeah, I could see that. Or I think maybe authenticity in the sense of you get a glimpse into the way that person perceives the world or operates within that world, and if that's the case, then yeah, I definitely, yeah, or that notion of being true to yourself, or true to your vision, maybe.